Sometimes things need a second chance. And that's certainly the case with the TED Talk we're going to be looking at today. This was one of the first TED Talks I've watched. If you've seen my speech on Ken Robinson, you'll know that in 2012 I got told about TED, I went to the TED website, and I just worked my way from top to bottom. Here are the most popular TED Talks. And one of the articles on TED.com was 10 TED Talks you have to see. This was one of those talks. And I remember sitting there, 2012, 20 years old, watching this thinking, I don't really get it. Now here's the funny thing. This speech is all about the danger of a single story. And actually, as I was watching this, I was caught in a single story because I only really had a single story of what the world looked like. I grew up in rural Scotland, in a place that's whiter than white, and I had a very homogenous growing up. When I watched this speech a second time, I'd experienced the world in a different way. This was a speech that I returned to in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd, after the rise in awareness of Black Lives Matter. And when I watched this speech again through that frame and that understanding, now I understood what it was talking about. So there's always value in going back and seeing a talk. And this is something that we get to appreciate as an audience. It's also something we need to appreciate as a speaker. That sometimes when we deliver a speech, it won't necessarily land at that time, in that place, for that audience. But that doesn't mean it's not a speech that's worth delivering. Sometimes you just need to change one of those factors for that speech to click in. It's the importance of repetition. If you have an important message to share, you can't just share it once and, all right, okay, cool, I've done that, everyone should get it now. It's something you have to hammer home repeatedly. What we're going to look at today is looking through that fresh perspective of the power and the danger of a single story. Now, just before we get into the speech analysis, legal disclaimer out of the way. I can't even say it properly. I've done it so many times. The footage that I'm using today is provided by TED.com. I do not claim ownership of the footage. The use of the footage is for informational and educational purposes only. And I certainly think this is a very important educational speech that we need to listen to. So with that fluff out of the way, let's now look at this speech, The Danger of a Single Story, by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie.
But that is another story. What this demonstrates, I think, is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly as children. Because all I had read were books in which characters were foreign, I had become convinced that books, by their very nature, had to have foreigners in them and had to be about things.
One of the things that strikes me straight away with Chimamanda is she has a pristine voice. Now, Chimamanda is not a professional speaker. She is a writer first and foremost. And we'll notice some aspects where that non-professional speaker background comes through in her speaking. But where I think her strength comes from is from that writing background. The way that she speaks is eloquent, it's fluent. I did not hear a single filler word this whole speech. Now, if you're familiar with Toastmasters, you know that Toastmasters, one of the things that they bang on about is removing these filler words, these ams, ers, you knows, so's, all right, like. And we can actually see some very accomplished speakers who use these quite a lot. In the last TED analysis that I looked at, Ken Robinson, he actually uses a lot of filler words. So it's not that you can't be successful with filler words, but when you notice someone who has that mastery over not using them at all, it's something that stands out. Chimamanda has this very enunciated pronunciation. She's got this smooth, velvety quality to her voice, and that I think is one of the strengths that she builds around. She builds around her eloquence and use of language from her writing background, and then has this smooth, velvety voice in terms of the delivery. And that's one of the things we always need to look at as speakers, is identifying what are our strengths and to double down on those strengths and to build our speeches around utilizing our strengths in the best possible way.
And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard...
Do you hear that little bit of emphasis on make something? We were just talking about Chimanda's voice there. And when we're talking about using the voice, it's not about having this mad all over the place. I'm going loud and quiet. I'm going to speak really fast and really slow. It's not about the extremities of our vocal range. It's about the subtleties and understanding when and where to apply the nuance. And so here we hear that. We have, again, that smooth, velvety, natural default tone that Chimamanda uses, and then she brings in that little bit of emphasis on make. And as you can see, she doesn't go, I didn't understand that anyone can actually make something. She doesn't over egg it. It's just that little bit of incision at that key point. And that's where we build our emphasis. Emphasis is rarely about the extremities. Of course, the extremities are there to be used. It's more often about understanding how to tweak that dial just a little bit at the opportune moment.
She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music, and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. She assumed that I did not know how.
I like this little moment where Chimamanda savors her joke. She tells the joke, and then she's going on to basically read her next part. The audience are laughing, and she just gets caught up in the moment there with the audience emotion, the audience response, and she savors and sits in her own humor. And this is a really important thing to do when you have these emotional moments. And you know what, especially when you have the positive moments as well, when you have the laugh, when you have the uplifting moment, when you have that energy, sit and savor in that uplifting energy. And I'm going to talk a little bit later on in the video of opportunities that Chimamanda didn't take to do this. But this is an opportunity she did take. She made a connection with the audience, she got them to laugh, and then she savored that and she had a nice big smile and sitting in that moment for herself.
What struck me was this: she had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me as an African was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity.
We've got a little bit of alliteration there. And what I like about this, it's a little bit of double alliteration. So we've got the, now, Chimamanda says patronizing, but growing up in Nigeria, I would have thought she would have grown up with British English and said patronizing. I wonder if this is a deliberate change for her audience. Now, this particular TED is actually being hosted in London. So again, you think you'd be speaking to a British audience, but maybe there's that element of being aware that actually most of the audience who might end up watching this are American. So potentially a little bit of a change there. Or that's just the way that she has learned to pronounce patronizing, we would say in British English, patronizing in American English. So it could just be how she says it normally. It could be an adaptation to the audience. It might also be to get a little bit of more inflection on this alliteration. We've got patronizing pity, patronizing pity. So we've got the p sound of alliteration, but we actually have the t. We have two words that are p vowel t. And when you have that p vowel t, it doesn't matter what that vowel is in the middle, you're still going to create a similar kind of s sound. Whether it's pat or pet or pit or pot or put, you can hear the pt. So you've actually got this double alliteration that comes in here, and that makes that statement stand out even more. And when we're thinking about, well, why do we use these techniques in the first place? Why are we using alliteration? Why are we using emphasis? She wants to emphasize that idea of this was, I believe she's speaking about her roommate at college. This was her roommate's impression of her, patronizing pity. And the reason she wants that phrase to stand out is because that links into the message of the danger of a single story. The single story that her roommate had was patronizing pity. And that message stands out in our memory. It's something that we remember about this of, oh, actually, maybe my single story that I might have is also patronizing pity. And maybe that single story could do with expanding.
But what is important about his writing is that it represents the beginning of a tradition of telling African stories in the West. A tradition of sub-Saharan Africa as a place of negatives, of difference, of darkness, of people who, in the words of the wonderful poet Rudyard Kipling, are half devil, half child.
Do you hear that repetition there? Of this, of this, of this, of this. She's using that repetitive phrase to hammer home this idea of, well, this is all of the negative connotations that people often have about the continent of Africa. Of. She's using that list to build up the idea and to showcase and highlight this danger of a single story. Of you've got this single story that's all of this stuff, but ultimately it's nothing of this other stuff. And that other aspect, the positive side of things, she then goes on to develop in the speech. So she's using that list to build up her argument, build up her case of this is what a dangerous single story looks like, so that she can dismantle and break that down later in the speech.
I remember first feeling slight surprise, and then I was overwhelmed with shame. I realized that I had been so immersed in the media coverage of Mexicans that they had become one thing in my mind, the abject immigrant. I had bought into the single story of Mexicans, and I could not have been more ashamed of myself.
I love this moment of personal vulnerability here. It's so easy when you are delivering a speech and you're showcasing a message and you're highlighting an issue to make this issue external to yourself and have yourself on a pedestal of, I am the wise teacher, showing you what folly you have to be following this pretense, to be buying into this problem, to be subject to this infliction. What we see here is Chimamanda takes herself off that pedestal and she goes, single stories are so dangerous. And I know they are because I have bought into them as well. And anytime as a speaker, it's really important to take yourself off that pedestal because that's how you relate to the audience. Chimamanda needs to relate to the audience and showcase we are all buying into single stories that are harming us. And when she has that relation with the audience, she can then step back up onto the pedestal a little bit to demonstrate that authority and leadership and say, this is where we go to get out of the danger of a single story. But she has to have that relatability first. If she stays up on that pedestal and say, you've all bought into a single story, follow me and I'll lead you somewhere better, you're going to get that defensiveness, that resistance, that skepticism. So this is a really important moment that Chimamanda is bringing in here of showcasing that vulnerability, showcasing how all of us can be afflicted by this issue. And then that gives her more credibility to lead the audience towards a solution.
Start the story with the arrows of the Native Americans and not with the arrival of the British, and you have an entirely different story. Start the story with the failure of the African state and not with the colonial creation of the African state, and you have an entirely different story.
Do you hear that repetition of start the story? This is a technique called anaphora. So anaphora is repeating a phrase at the start of a statement. The way I remember it is anaphora at the start. A for anaphora, A for at the start. And when you use this repeated phrase at the beginning, it draws people's attention to what you're going to say next. At the start of the story, at the start of the story. Okay, this is what I need to do at the start of the story. So by using that repeated phrase, she's highlighting to the audience, well, this is how we start to move into some of the solution. If we start the story a different way, we start to see things differently and we'll start to get different outcomes. But she has to seed and anchor all that with the beginning phrase of start the story. If she just goes, do this and then do this and then do that and then that will be better and this will change things, the audience can get a little bit lost along the way. Whereas using that same repeated phrase as an anchoring point, it keeps the audience on track and it keeps them focused on, okay, this is one thing that we can do. This is one thing that we can do. This is one thing that we can do. Using repetition draws the audience's attention. And when you're using repetition, you've got to think about what you're wanting to draw the audience's attention to. What Chimamanda is doing here by having the repetition at the start of the statement is she's activating their attention so they'll be more attentive and listening for the bit that comes next, the solution-focused statement.
That Nigerian men were physical abusers like the father character in my novel. I told him that I had just read a novel called American Psycho. And that it was such a shame that young Americans were serial murderers. Now,
again, we see another moment of telling a joke, getting the audience response, and you can see that Chimamanda, she kind of wants to move on in the speech again, but she feeds off the moment, she savors it, embraces it, and then she gets an applause break as well. And that's the dream if you're a speaker. Getting an applause break showcases that what you have said has really landed and hit home for the audience. It's not something you factor into a speech. You don't go, I am going to write this, and then I'm going to plan for this applause break here. You might anticipate that this is something that could get an applause break, but you never exactly know for sure. So there's always a little bit of being there in the moment and being ready to respond to the audience's reaction. So this is the balance between having scripted and unscripted. So you have something that's scripted in terms of this is the thing that I'm planning to say, but the response you get in the moment is unscripted. You can plan for a big laugh for a joke and it doesn't really get laughed at all. You can say a throwaway line that you didn't even think was funny and the audience can burst out laughing. You've always got to be there in the moment so you're able to respond to what the audience is giving back to you. And Chimamanda in this moment, she sees that she's got a good response from the audience, and instead of stepping on it and trying to push through it, she just allows herself to sit and savor and enjoy.
Writers were expected to have had really unhappy childhoods to be successful. I began to think about how I could invent horrible things my parents had done to me. But
I love that line. Invent things, horrible things that my parents have done to me. Really, really cute line. Nice little playing with this idea of the tortured writer. And Chimamanda kind of breaking that stereotype a little bit and saying, actually, I'm not the tortured writer here. I'm not the depressed creative. But maybe I thought that I should had to be. Maybe I thought that was something I had to work into my identity. So it's a cute little line. It's a little bit of breaking convention, breaking norms, subverting expectations, gets a little laugh from the audience as a result.
The single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make...
Great line. That for me, I think, is the standout line of this speech. It's got this wonderful nuance and truth to it. A lot of the time we can put things in black and white and say that everyone is like this. Stereotypes teach us things. They are simple pathways to teach us about who or what something is going to be like. And there'll be other people who say, no, stereotypes are evil and bad and awful. We should get away from them. What we're seeing here is playing with the nuance that's in between. And I think this line really crystallizes it. It's not that stereotypes are untrue. Stereotypes are stereotypes for a reason. They give us a broad brushstroke. And stereotypes can have a positive and negative valence. We can have a stereotype of this type of person is always good at something, or this type of person is always bad at something. Both of those are stereotypes. Both of them can be helpful or harmful. Well, what we see here is playing with that nuance of they don't provide the complete picture. They have things missing from them. And this line, the reason why I like that line so much, number one, because it's got so much nuance and subtlety and truth in it, But that for me is almost the tagline of the whole overarching speech. The danger of a single story. Well, a single story is a stereotype. A stereotype is one story, it's one perspective on a person, a place, a thing. And that line encapsulates why a single story sucks. A single story sucks because it does not provide us a complete picture. It does not provide us the rich depth and truth of a person, a place, a subject, an issue. And that for me, that line just boom, it really just brings all of the speech together. It's a catchy thing. It's a tweetable line. A lot of people are obsessed with you've got to have lines in your speech that are tweetable. It's this beautiful key buzzword phrase, and it stands out, and for me just ties everything that Chimamanda is talking about in this speech nicely together. That is the highlight moment of this speech for me. And when you go and look on the video itself and you see the most replayed aspects of the speech, this peaks on the most replayed aspects of the speech. So clearly I'm not the only one who thought it was a good line.
So what if before my Mexican trip, I had followed the immigration debate from both sides, the US and the Mexican? What if my mother had told us that Fide's family was poor and hardworking? What if we had an African television network that broadcast diverse African stories all over the world, what the Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe calls a balance of stories? What if my roommate knew about my Nigerian publisher, Mukhtar Bakare, a remarkable man who left his job in a bank to follow his dream and start a publishing house? Now, the conventional wisdom was that...
You heard it again, right? Anaphora. What if, what if, what if, what if? Chimamanda uses as what ifs. And you see how after that anaphora, she actually has this long detailed description. And with that long detailed description, you might have a risk of losing the audience in that description. So again, she's using the anaphora as an anchor of what if this is a difference? What if this is a difference? Rather than going difference, 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 difference. And then one difference can almost get lost in the multiple differences. The audience go, oh yeah, there was something about looking at things a different way. So using that anaphora, it just breaks things up and it re-engages the audience's attention. It's a marker of, okay, pay attention to this next thing that's coming. What if, pay attention. What if, pay attention. What if, pay attention. So again, using that repetition and using it thoughtfully to think of, okay, when do I need to spike the audience's attention? When do I need to bring them back into point and help them to focus on a key aspect of my speech?
Stories matter. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign. But stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. The American writer
That little moment to me, it was very poetic language. Stories can do this and stories can do this. Stories can do this, stories can do this. And that little sequence there, it really sounded like it was coming from a writer. It had this poetry and richness of the language. So again, it's focusing back on something we talked about earlier on in the video of playing to your strengths. Chimamanda is a writer. She's going to have that use of language, that richness of vocabulary that's going to make aspects of her speech stand out. And I think that's what we saw in that little play there. That was something that felt and sounded very poetic. There was almost this different resonance and feeling to it as you listen to it. So really great to see Chimamanda, again, bringing in her strengths as a writer. Her strengths are as a writer, they are not as a speaker. And we'll touch on aspects where that is showing that she is more of a writer than a speaker in some of the highlights and opportunities for improvement that she could make. But what we see there is her drawing upon her strengths of going, okay, let's make the language stand out here. Let's make the richness of the words stand out. So it's really nice poetic resonance going through that aspect of the speech. And it's now coming to the end of the speech. So you're thinking about, how do I make the audience feel something in this moment, and how do I leave them with a feeling that they'll remember? They won't necessarily remember the exact words, although if you can get them to remember the exact words, that's even better. But now you're starting to guide them towards a feeling, because the intellectual memory of the words will fade, but the emotional memory of how they felt after listening to your speech, that lasts a lot longer. And that's what you've got to be thinking of as you build towards this end point. Would you like to step onto the TED stage one day, just like Chimamanda? Well, I have a workshop that'll be helpful for you. In the video description below, I've got a link to a recording of a 60-minute workshop that I did for one of the TEDx events that I coach here in Scotland. In this workshop, you're going to learn the key foundations of what makes a successful TED Talk. Looking at those TED Talks that have had an impact, that have resonated through the years, just like what Chimanda's has done. You'll be able to reverse engineer and dissect that for thinking about how you can have an impact with your TED Talk as well. This workshop is totally free. All you have to do is click the description below, you sign up, don't even have to enter your credit card details. It is free, just for you as a little ongoing education as part of watching this video series. Now, looking at how we can improve even the greats, let's now look at how Chimamanda could have improved her TED Talk in this instance.
I'm a storyteller, and I would like to tell you a few personal stories about what...
First sentence. I. Don't start your speech with I, because the audience don't care about you. I don't mean that in a mean, malicious way. The audience are there because they want to hear a speech that's for them. And at some point, they want to find out more about you, and they are interested in the I aspect. But what you've got to begin with is you. Show the audience, why should you be listening to this? What are you going to get from it? So when your first sentence has two I's and no U's, that's not the best start for drawing the audience in. So I'll be looking at reworking this opening. There's a few things that I'm going to look at in this opening that could have been jiggled around a little bit to make this opening a bit more punchy and a bit more relatable to the audience. This was the first thing, coming right out of the blocks with the I statements rather than the you statements.
I grew up on a university campus in eastern Nigeria. My mother says that I started reading at the age of 2, although I think 4 is probably close to the truth. So I was an early reader.
I just felt this statement here, it didn't really have an impact on the audience. What I think here, so we hear this story, my mum said I started reading at 2, but maybe 4 was more likely. It felt like it should have been a joke, but it ended up not being a joke. And I think that's what confused me a little bit. I think I would either go for, okay, let's make this more a thing that my mum thought that I was a genius. She said I was reading from 2 years old. She was signing me up for NASA. Like, I would lean into that a little bit more and have a little bit of exaggeration and turn it into a joke. Or just cut that bit out of the story and say, I can remember reading from as young as 4. Just make it a fact and use it as a small detail and move on with the story. I just felt there was a bit of a pacing issue that came in, and you really don't want to have a pacing issue at the start of your speech, because at the start of your speech, you're trying to build that momentum, you're trying to build that energy, you're trying to establish that rapport quickly with the audience. So when we've got this stilted statement there that could have been a joke but wasn't really, could have been a fact but had a little bit too much fluff on it, I just felt that it really affected the pacing. And we're 30 seconds in here, and I've already picked up on 2 things at the start here where there's a focus on I and not you, and then there's a little bit of a pacing issue. If you're going into personal story, make sure the pacing is sharp, it's entertaining, it's enthralling, it's pulling the audience's curiosity in. And in order to do that, it doesn't have to be fast, as in you're speaking very fast, but it has to have a pacing where it's pulling the audience in. And if it's a slow, stilted pace, it's not really going to do that.
I was also an early writer. And when I began to...
Now, sorry about the camera work here. I know that my my video is superimposing over Chimamanda at the moment. I'm not thrilled with the camera work of this particular TED. This is one of the sort of earlier TED Talks. Has come from 2009, and this isn't even the main stage at the event. This is like an offshoot, and the irony is that this offshoot speech is probably more famous than whatever was going on on the main stage. But you can see it's a little bit simplistic. We don't have the red circle. Sacrilege, there's no red circle. So I'm not too keen on the camera work here, but what I hope you can see is Chimanda's hands really get glued to the podium. Let me just play on a little bit and you might see it a bit more. Yeah, there we go, there we go. So you'll see that her hands get glued onto the podium. And this is where they stay the whole speech. You have noticed Chimanda's using notes, and this is not a don't use notes in a speech. We can see effective use of notes. And I don't think Chimanda's use of notes is bad. There's maybe a little bit of optimization in terms of she is sometimes looking down at her notes when she's speaking rather than looking up at the audience. Not too big an issue. I don't think she's doing a public reading, so I'm fine with that. The issue with using notes and the issue with having a podium, I really do not like podiums, especially in the center of the stage. Chimamanda gets glued to the podium and she gets stuck there. There's no extra body language coming off. So all we really get in this speech is the power of her voice as a technique. We don't get then the power of body language coming into that as well. And it's not that you can't deliver an effective speech with minimal body language, because hey, this is still one of the most watched TED Talks of all time, right? So it doesn't make this speech a terrible speech because her hands get glued to the podium, but it does reduce some opportunities to add extra energy, to add extra emphasis, to even make extra connective opportunities with the audience. So what I'd be looking at instead is getting that podium off to the side with the notes, and Chimamanda can go and refer to those notes when needed. I don't think she's confident enough with her speech to do that. And I think this is where you see Chimamanda not being a professional speaker here. She is a professional writer, not a professional speaker. So she's using those notes as a bit more of a crutch. So I'd be looking at her and going, okay, ideal scenario would be no notes at all, obviously, that's the dream. Second best scenario would be notes off to the side and just using them as a reference point and then coming back into the stage. The third option is then going, okay, have the podium off center, like not right at the side, but let's just get that podium away from being a barrier between you and the audience and get you away from the podium. It's fine for you to go to the podium, collect what you're going to say, and then say it to the audience. And you can even have a little bit of back and forth of reading, addressing. So she can have this back and forth, but let's get that podium away from being a physical barrier, open up that connection to the audience, and let's get your hands off that podium. What we've got here, I would say, is the worst case scenario. The podium is right in front, it's forming a barrier, and it is sticking her hands. And it's getting her stuck to her notes as well. So I would be going for the next option above from that of, okay, I can see that you're feeling not confident to come off the notes or have the notes far away. Let's just get that podium out of the way a little bit. Your notes are still there. They're still going to help you. But let's reduce that barrier, open up some more connection with the audience, and let's get you a little bit more open and expressive with your body language as well.
I wrote exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. All my characters were white and blue-eyed. They played in the snow. They ate apples.
There's a joke in there, isn't there? And you can almost hear this ripple of laughter that goes through the audience. And I think that Chimamanda just needed to make a bit more of this as a joke. You've seen earlier on in the video, I highlighted some aspects where she told a joke, she got this really good response to the audience, she savored it, she smiled and laughed along. But those moments came later in the speech. she actually has some of these moments in the beginning of the speech where that doesn't happen, where there's an opportunity for humor and she doesn't quite take it or doesn't quite properly step into it, or she starts to get a little bit of response from the audience. And rather than savor it and rather than kind of draw that response out of the audience, she then skips over and moves to the next part. So again, I think this is just a little bit of a confidence issue of she's coming into the beginning of a speech. Of course, she's going to be feeling nervous. As I said, this is where that aspect of not being a professional speaker comes in. It's something that she isn't necessarily, she's probably used to it. She's done enough speeches, I'm sure, by now, but it's maybe not something that she's used to in terms of being comfortable with the feeling. It's taking her a little while to get into her speech and get warmed up and start to feel a little bit more comfortable. We're only a minute in, so those nerves are still going. She's still quite focused on, okay, this is what I want to say. I want to get my words right. I've got the notes here. Rather than having that opportunity of noticing when something is coming from the audience and just in the moment being able to react and respond to it. We see that later in the speech when she's more warmed up, but we see in the beginning of the speech that doesn't quite happen. And this is one of the first instances of it. So when you have that opportunity for humor, especially at the start of the speech, if you have humor in your speech, the earlier you can get the audience to laugh, the better. If you can get that first laugh out nice and early in the first 60 seconds, it helps to relax those nerves. It gives you so much more confidence. And it's also helping to build that connection with the audience as well.
And they talked a lot about the weather, how lovely it was that the sun had come out. Now this, despite the fact that I lived in Nigeria, I had never been outside Nigeria.
So here again, I think we just see a little bit of the confidence issue. Chimamanda doesn't need to explain the joke here. We know why it's funny that she writes that characters are all white, they play in the snow, they talk about the weather all the time. We know why that's funny. You can hear the audience laughing. The audience are laughing because they know why that's funny. They know why that's silly. So when Chimamanda then explains why the joke's funny, well, because I'm from Nigeria and nearly everyone in Nigeria is not white and there isn't snow. It flattens the emotional reaction from that joke. So you don't need to explain your humor. If the audience have already laughed, they've got the joke. If you have a joke that's more layered and you need to add some explanation, the explanation comes before the punchline. If you tell the punchline and then you have to explain it, you haven't done a good enough job of setting up the joke. But that's not the issue here. It's not that Chimamanda hasn't done a good enough job of setting up the joke. She set up the joke fine. The audience know why it's funny. So I think just a little bit more confidence here of recognizing that what she said was funny and just highlighting and focusing that a little bit more. There's maybe a couple comedic techniques that can come in. There's maybe a little bit of exaggeration, maybe a little bit of comedic timing, a little bit of a pause just to suck out the rest of that laugh there. The material that she's got is great. It's fine. It's funny. There's just a little bit of the confidence in the delivery that I think that doesn't quite come through this early in the speech. And then the explaining of the joke then really flattens what should be and is a funny moment. So she's built up the emotion and built up that response from the audience. And rather than riding that wave, it's almost like the wave gets squashed down a little bit, which means she has to work and build it back up again later in the speech.
The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous.
I'd have liked to have heard more of a voice change for the mother there. That voice, it sounded like Chimamanda speaking faster rather than like her mother speaking to her. So we've talked about Chimanda's voice earlier on in the speech and how that's been a strength of hers, and even how the subtle nuance that she brings in is adding to the speech. Here I think she needs to be less subtle. Here's where we're talking about actually reaching to those extremities does have its place. It's not about the nuance. when she is playing these different characters, when she is acting out the dialogue between them, her mother needs to have a distinctive voice. It needs to sound more motherly for me. And I think here it needs to either be deeper or sharper here. So rather than just speeding up, don't you know that boys like him have nothing to eat? It has to be, don't you know that boys like him have nothing to eat? Or don't you know that boys like him have nothing to eat? It needs to have a bit more of that authoritative edge to it. That's what I'd be looking to change a little bit more. When you have different characters in a story, and especially when you are speaking the dialogue of those characters, the voices have got to be distinctive. You don't want it to sound like you doing a bunch of bad impressions. You want it to sound like different people. And you don't have to have this actor's repertoire of accents and different voices to do it. It just needs a little bit more of the turning of the dials on your voice to make it sound different enough so the characters are starting to come to life.
I would like to end with this thought.
Don't tell us you'd like to end with something. Just end. To conclude, to summarize, to end with, these are lazy phrases and lazy transitions that speakers use when they don't know what else to say. And the thing is, when you're building the energy of your speech, the audience will feel when you are coming towards the end. They will feel that energy change and swerve. And ideally what you want them to do is to finish on a crescendo, to finish on a high. And you should be building into that. And the audience should feel the energy changing as you're going towards that. I was talking earlier on in the video about that lovely bit of poetic language that Chimamanda brings in shortly before this statement I would like to end with. Stories are this, stories are that. It had this poetic resonance. There was this smoothness and that richness. And you could feel the energy change in that moment. I talked about it being a resonance, didn't I? There was this different resonance of that part. You can feel that difference. You don't need to be told, oh, this bit's different because I'm about to end. So building up your ending in an energetic way rather than having to signpost it. Your audience should know when you're coming towards the end. Also, this is TED as well. Everyone knows that the speech is only 18 minutes long. They know you're going to end at 18 minutes. So you've got that working in your favor as well. But even without the time parameters, they should still feel the end. They should still feel what you're building into. And what I'd be saying for Chimamanda here is just continue with this smooth, poetic quality and round something off, almost like it's this swirl through the air of this richness and this beauty of language. And if you finish on that richness and swirl, almost like the swirl at the end of writing a signature, the audience will know that you finished. And you won't need to tell them, I want to end with, because they will already know. So you want to take these phrases out of your speaking. They're lazy transition phrases. They don't do anything to the speech. What you instead want to focus on is managing the energy of the speech. The audience know you're at the start. You know that they're at the climax of the story. And also they know that you are reaching the end of your speech as well. So what we can see here from Chimamanda, I would say it's probably the bookmarks of her speeches that need the most work here. There was, I would say, a slow start, a little bit stilted, a little bit missing in the execution of what she was doing. And I think that's just a sharpness that comes from doing more speaking, being more confident as a speaker, and having that little bit of direction and guidance as well of somebody being able to give you that feedback and say, oh, actually, this is how that comes across when you say it in this way. And similar, coming towards the end there as well. So I just think a little bit of sharpness of execution on those key moments of the speech. And here's the thing, as I've mentioned a couple of times already, Chimamanda is not a professional speaker. Yes, she does speeches, but what she focuses on is her writing. And what we can see here is there are some aspects of her speaking which demonstrate that she isn't a professional speaker. There are aspects of her speech that aren't as sharp as you'd see from someone who does this for a career. But what she focuses on is her strengths. She knows she's got a strong message. She knows that she has an ability to convey rich language, and the use of her language is really powerful. And that's what she focuses on. And that's why you'll notice that when I was pointing out points for improvement, There wasn't so much in the middle of the speech, because that's where she was able to play to her strengths and just get into storytelling mode, let the language do the work. And then some of those technical aspects of execution got pushed towards the side in those moments. And this is still one of the most watched TED Talks of all time. So it goes to show that you can still have elements of your speaking that are incorrect, but as long as you've got a few key aspects that stand out, that's what makes a memorable speech, and that's what makes an impactful speech. And yes, of course, we can always be aiming for improvement and to do things better and to build these skills and to have that sharpness adding on, but it's sharpening what is already there as a good essential core message and core story. If you don't have that good essential core message and core story, you can layer on all these public speaking techniques, you can do the voices and you can do the body language and you can have the catchy start and ending, you can have all that kind of stuff. But if you don't have that core aspect, it's going to feel like this very vapid, superficial speech. That's not what we want, and that's not what the purpose of these speech analyses are. It's to demonstrate how you build that core message, how you tell that great story, and how these techniques feed into you being able to do that. This is a speech that I've really benefited from coming back and watching a second time at a different point in my life and a different perspective when I had more than a single story to think about looking into it. Maybe you have a similar thing with a TED Talk as well. Maybe there's a TED Talk that you watched years ago and you kind of went, oh, I didn't get it. Simon Sinek, start with why, what, who, or Ken Robinson, schools suck. Amy Cuddy, I should be standing like this. Susan Cain, why are introverts good? Maybe you just didn't get it at the time. What's a TED Talk that you can maybe go back and watch with a different perspective and a different light and find new lessons from it? Because then we have more than a single story enriching our perspectives, and that's what Chimamanda was all about in this TED Talk here.